Hi, my name is Keith Koffler. I wrote a biography of Steve Bannon, who's the head of Breitbart, former senior White House aide, and I am lucky enough today to have Steve with me to follow up on some of the things that are in the book and to let him give his take on some of it. We actually had 10 hours of conversations for the book. He was kind enough to do that and talk about all sorts of topics. So here he is for you to give some of his own take on some of the things in the book.
10 hours and you didn't get enough? By the way, the official title is Senior Counselor and Chief Strategist to the President.
Yes.
You wrote the biography. Don't even have that in there?
I'm here with a very
I'm
here with a very prickly Steve Bannon this morning who wants to make sure his title.
10 hours.
Yes.
10 hours you didn't get
10 hours of interview.
10 hours of interview.
Yeah, well, 2 hours were off the record.
Yeah.
So
I have ex-wives in this.
You better behave yourself.
I have ex-wives. I didn't have conversations for 10 hours.
That's right. Yes. Not as enjoyable.
All my ex-wives. I love all of you girls. I love all you gals, so don't take offense.
Right. Well, I'll let them know what you said, and then you can I can relate to them. All right, let's start. Then. Okay. So I think we could talk about something.
You had to write these questions down. We just couldn't have a free-flowing conversation since you.
I'm going to ask you, because the way he works, I'm going to ask him one question, and he's going to go and take it from there.
I'm not going to filibuster.
So this is all worthless.
I'm not going to filibuster. I promise I won't filibuster.
Because I don't have his memory. He has a tremendous memory, is one of the things that I found out. So that's for his enemies, too. So let's talk a little bit about something that probably your viewers don't hear too much about, and that is the Steve Bannon growing up. So what... I have I talked to a lot of people. What were you like as a kid? How did it form you?
Look, it's a very, everybody in the audience had this, or virtually everybody had this upbringing. Very, working class, middle class. Mom stayed at home, raised 5 kids. She never learned to drive, right? So she was a real mom around the house. And my dad was a foreman, and then worked his way up, went to high school, and then worked his way up to a lower level white collar management, but a guy that took the bus to work and was home every day at 6 o'clock until later when I went to college. He got a little more senior, but when I was a kid, he was home every day at 6. Family ate around the table. Was very. If you look at those sitcoms from the 50s, it's very much that kind of environment. So it was I was a paper boy, cut grass. So it's a unremarkable childhood. I was just another Schmendrick, run around with the big family and neighborhood. One thing I was proud of my neighborhood in Richmond is that we were talking about the other day. I think in the 2 blocks that we had at this neighborhood, kind of in inner city Richmond, 5 naval officers came out. My kid, I was a destroyer officer. My kid brother was a Navy pilot. The 2 boys across the street, one became a surface warfare officer, one was a nuclear power officer, and there was another nuclear power officer down the street. So 5 naval officers in really a block and a half.
Right.
So it was a typical, 50s, 60s Americana neighborhood.
Typical, but some of
the very, but it was nothing extra. I mean, in hindsight, it's extraordinary because, and you realize, traveling all over the world and meeting people, and now, having had the opportunity to go to Harvard and Goldman Sachs and be in those conference rooms and boardrooms, that you understand that the most important thing is not money, right? It's what your parents give you and that kind of solid base of family life.
We'll get to more of that, but you, from the people that I talked to who knew you as a child, say that, and Steve is actually far more modest than people realize. He likes to talk about the issues, but not so much about what he did personally. That you were not sort of the average Schmedrick, that you were kind of tough, you got in some fights, some scraps, you didn't take a lot of nonsense for people. On the other hand, you were a bookworm. Yeah. Tell me about that sort of...
my mom and dad were great. My grandfather only went to the 3rd grade, right? And my dad was a high school graduate. My mom was a high school graduate. But they were very bookish. I mean, going to my grandparents' house, the big thing was on Sunday morning to go get the New York Daily News, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, which would be delivered to a central place, and you go buy them. So the Sundays they were big readers, and I was a paper boy. It just, my mom was a bookworm, and so she read a lot. So that just, and it's one of those things you just pass down to kids. So look, I'd like to fight and I like to read, but other than that, it was not. Trust me, I was middle of the class on grades. I was an average athlete. So it's not.
I looked at his yearbook.
Yeah, no, it's not. It was a remarkable childhood in the fact that it had this kind of Americanness to it, and this solid, Catholic family life and everything like that. But it was I was not. Trust me, I was not any super achiever. So if your kids are middle of the pack
Right.
and average athletes, everything's going to be fine, right? It'll all work out in time.
But yeah, a lot of people with superior intellects are not necessarily super achievers in school. Tell me, it was fairly liberal family. Your mom, as I understand it, was pretty liberal, and in Richmond, Virginia, was talking about rights for African Americans. Wouldn't call them that then, but that she was almost like a proponent of civil rights, and that the family generally was pretty liberal, kind of Kennedy Democrats. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, Kennedy Democrats. My older brother says, you don't know what being a Democrat is until you walk the neighborhood for Adlai Stevenson the second time, right? No, but it was a very democratic, blue collar family.
Yeah.
I think I don't know how liberal it was. I think one of the big decisions my parents made in 66, 67, we had bought an older house in an older neighborhood.
Right.
In the late 50s.
Yes.
I think they paid $6,000 or $7,000 for the house.
Right.
And what happened is that the neighborhood around it, everything started to desegregate. And so many people and our neighbors, so many people just fled to the suburbs. And my mom made a decision that, hey, we were going to stay here, my mom and dad, that we weren't going to flee. And so the neighborhood over time, the north side of Richmond, became more of a predominantly black working class neighborhood, which was fine with us. It was, and so my mom, she had a lot of black friends, became, very engaged in the community, and things worked out. I mean, she was not a fire-breathing liberal, but it was just these people were neighbors. I think what actually made us more conservative, although Kennedy Democrats are pretty conservative, was the Vietnam War. I mean, I went to a Catholic military school that was kind of the centerpiece of the Catholic community in town, and I just remember how vicious the Vietnam War broke apart the parish. You had people that were very, peaceniks, and you had people who came from the military families that we had, were quite pro Vietnam War, and that was really the shift. And I remember when I was a kid, you couldn't have a worse word. Nixon was a curse word in the Bannon household because he had run against Jack Kennedy, right? It was just unheard of.
Right.
And I remember my parents in '72 actually, everybody talking and actually voting for Nixon against McGovern, and I think they might have voted against Humphrey in '68, but it was that the Vietnam War kind of did that.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about what you said. Sort of average middle class family in a lot of ways, and let's bring that then a little bit more up to date. Talk about how, I think a lot of people don't realize because there are a lot of caricatures out there, but I think a lot of what you are doing today is fighting for average working people, fighting for the middle class. Talk about how your family, your dad, what happened to him in 2008, what the elites did to him in 2008.
Well, after working at Goldman Sachs, I saw when the financial crisis, I'd been overseas actually working in Shanghai a lot. I had a company over there. We were consolidating in Asia and in Korea and in China. And I really came back to sell some real estate I had in the spring and summer of 2008, and was coming back and forth. And I noticed, particularly with bankruptcy of Bear Stearns earlier in the year, that looked like the financial situation I thought was getting very questionable. In fact, I was trying to cash out some assets, thinking there might be something coming. I was talking to my dad, and AT&T stock would be like selling stock in the Catholic Church, right? It was something that his father had as a union guy, and my dad had, and he just didn't sell it. And I remember he would tell about sometimes his net worth going up, about how well AT&T was doing. When the financial crash happened, it was so stunning to me, because Hank Paulson, I had worked for him as a very junior guy at Goldman Sachs.
Oh, had you really?
Yeah. I mean, I was like a bag carrier, right? Hank was a partner and a new business guy. I would go out for these meetings and be one of the grundoons on the team. But it was just so shocking to me how much the financial elite completely bailed. And Washington, the Bush administration just bailed on this thing.
Right.
And they let the devil catch the hindmost. And I remember when Kramer came on TV on CNBC and said, if you need cash in the next 3 years, you got to sell everything.
Right.
And a guy like my father sees, the stock market collapsing, nobody doing anything.
Right.
They blur their stocks and leave a lot of money on the table. And really, it's their entire net worth for their retirement. Besides a $6,000 house. And you realize that the game is rigged. That you see the bailouts start to come. You see the whole $1,000 trillion of capital infusion. The Goldman Sachs is to get taken care of. The GE Capitals get taken care of. The law firms get taken care of. But it's the little guy that gets screwed. So that was an eye opener at the beginning of the Tea Party. That this thing I had been brought up in the 50s and 60s is a very precious thing. That is
Right.
what America is based upon. These guys are the guys that don't ask for. And by the way, my brother and I had been naval officers, right? We'd been in the Pacific. My kid brother had been in Libya with the Gaddafi situation. I'd been on a destroyer during the Iran hostage crisis.
Right.
And we're not extraordinary. We're just the typical kids of middle class and working class people that go serve the country. And you realize that the elites could care less about that. They just don't care about it. As
Right.
long as those people pay their taxes and send their sons and daughters off in the military, they're going to get they're going to get the short end of the stick all the time. And that's, to me, the beginning of this populist revolt. Although obviously it goes back to Perot and Buchanan and Reagan.
Right.
You could see in this Tea Party, and I said, this thing is real, because if this unites, and by the way, it's not about color, race, or ethnicity. I come from a black working class neighborhood. The black working class and Hispanic working class are the people that have gotten screwed the most
Right.
in this entire situation. So
Right.
I think from that time on, that's really my more involvement, not just in my films, but really with Breitbart, started to see that there was a real groundswell of this. And then obviously, Donald Trump came along in 2015, and I think really took that whole kind of disparate movement and gave it some sort of kind of motive force.
Why the shift to politics for you? In other words, you'd done many things. You've been in the military. You had been. I mean, you described it a little bit, but how did you get so passionate about it and decide that this?
Well, I
is what
just
you wanted
started
to devote
making.
your
I
life
wanted to
to?
make a film. During the when 9/11 happened, I had so many
Right.
buddies of mine that were all singing "God Bless America" down in Greenwich Village, and I said, hey, it's not going to be too long before you're starting to take on radical Islamic terrorism, that they're not going to be singing,
Right.
there's going to be some real divisions in the country. And Peter Schweitzer had written this book called Reagan's War, about
Right.
the long struggle Reagan had against communism. And I said, boy, what a great way to tell the story of our war against another radical ideology, which is radical Islamic jihad. Do it through that movie. In doing that, I started meeting people in politics, Dave
Okay.
Bossie, etc.
Sure.
And I was still a filmmaker. All I was doing was making documentaries.
Right.
And I decided to focus on the Tea Party.
Right.
Because I said, this is the most interesting thing in politics right now. This is really a grassroots revolt that represents the values of my middle class upbringing. It was only getting more involved was really Andrew passing away,
Right.
and really having the burden of having to step in and really take over the Breitbart on a day-to-day basis, just to kind of keep it afloat at the time, because the leadership was more of a business leadership than a content leadership. So it was just one step after the other.
So let me draw back a little bit, back to you a little bit, but this also informs, I know you're thinking a lot, the Catholicism. Now that was a very important part of your upbringing in Richmond. You were an altar boy. And I know that it's had a strong effect on you and been very meaningful to you throughout your life. I think a lot of people don't realize that. And one of the first people I talked to about you said, hey, he knows the Bible, like you need to ask him about that. Can you talk about how the Catholicism has informed your life personally, but also your political thinking?
Well, I think first off, if you're raised in a observant Catholic family, right, and my grandmother had been a convert from, I think she was a Southern Baptist. She'd been a convert, and when Southern Baptists convert to Catholicism, she was like hardcore.
Okay.
At one point in time, she was a daily communicant, but she was the one that really kept the family focused on Catholicism. My dad was very devout, and my mom was, and so
Right.
we came from a very observant Catholic family, and and I had uncles and other that became religious, either monks or priests.
Oh,
so it was always a part, and also the Catholic Church, particularly in the South. Remember, up until I think it was the 40s, Virginia and other parts of the South were still considered mission territories, right? It was,
Right.
it was not. I mean, that's one thing about these guys like the Klan and the Neo-Confederates. My dad would always tell us stories about how when he was growing up, priests were actually tarred and feathered by the KKK. Back in the 30s, the
Right.
KKK was quite prevalent.
Anti-Catholic as well.
Very,
Yeah.
virulently anti-Catholic.
Right.
So, not as bad as they were. Obviously very racist and very anti-Semitic, but they were anti-Catholic also. So, the Catholic Church becomes a cultural thing.
Right.
To culturally be a Catholic is almost as powerful as the religious part of it, because the church is such a community when you grow up, and
Right.
particularly being Irish Catholic, right, which has a whole nother connotation to it. It's kind of clannish,
Right.
thing. So the church has always been, you raise a Catholic, it stays with you forever. So I think it does give you a view, particularly I think in regards to capitalism. One thing is, it's always struck me when I really got more involved in conservatism, the way people addressed economics. And I realize you got the Protestant work ethic and everything like that, but I call it kind of the Cato, this kind of Cato Austrian economics.
Right.
It just didn't feel, it cut so across the grain of how you're raised as a Catholic that there's an enlightened form of capitalism.
Right.
And then this whole, bare knuckles, everything is related to net present value. Everything's related to return on investment. It's just not the way Catholics think. It's not the way Catholics are brought up to think, not just the religious teaching, but the sociological part of being Catholic. So that's why I've always, as a populist, it's just never, and I talk about this all the time, that I think one of the things that conservatives got way off base is for a couple of decades, everything became about the economy.
Right.
It was this thing. I remember, like 6 weeks before an election, the big number was what's the unemployment rate going to be 6 weeks before and people were like all hang on the number. That's going to determine the election. It's going to be so important. It's that everything, and it's go jobs, jobs, jobs. It's only the economy, stupid.
Right.
It became this thing that obsessed about GDP growth or about the economy. And to me, even numbers that are, when you really think about them, are not that important when we really talk about economic well-being. And one thing I thought, coming as a Catholic and then looking at American history, we're a civic society. We're a community first. We're a country first.
Right.
We're an economy. Don't get me wrong. I went to Harvard Business School. I worked at Goldman Sachs. My entire career has been advising people about putting money to work and putting my own money to work.
Right.
So I'm a capitalist.
Right.
But it's capitalism in a defined context, not this Cato Institute.
Right.
And I love my libertarian brothers.
Right.
I do love my libertarian brothers, but I just don't buy off on some of this stuff, this Austrian school of economics.
It's the bean counting that gets away from, well, how are we affecting the culture? How are we affecting average people? And that's what concerns
And
me.
I understand if the bean counters sit there and go, oh, when you add all that stuff in, it gets too confusing.
Right.
Look, I'm very good at doing the math on what internal equity is, or net present value, or free cash flow. I can do that, but it's you got to make decisions in a broader context and just and just what EBITDA, what your EBITDA. And I think it's one of the things that flows through the policy. I keep saying on HB1 visas, I make a big deal about this and say, hey, look, the Black and Hispanic working class, and even the white working class, kids who are all in these STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math, in public schools, until they can get into engineering schools, until they can then go to Silicon Valley and work in the tech jobs, we're not going to really solve a lot of the problems in the inner cities. But if they're blocked out from doing it, and one of the reasons they're blocked out is HB1 visas, which the tech companies say, oh, we're just doing it because we want Einsteins there. And I say, well, no, hold it. The average pay of an HB1 visa, I think, is $105,000 a year. You're not paying Einstein that. You're just trying to get a higher operating margin. I got that. Higher margin means higher stock price. But it's more important for us as a country to have people fully engaged and fully employed in tech jobs. So it's one of the reasons that I can translate that to HB1 visas.
And it's interesting. One of the more interesting things that you said in the book that I think contradicts the kind of caricatures that are out there of you is that you think the Republican Party can become a permanent Republican Party, permanently in power, if they get 30% of the Black working class, 30% of the Hispanic working class. Probably could only get 20% of the Black working class. You could do that. So how does this? How does this appeal to them?
Because it's an existential threat. I went to Charleston the other day, and they had 250 riot police, and they had barricades in downtown because the Grim Reaper from Saturday Night Live was coming down to give a talk at the Citadel. But earlier in the day, I talked to 50 Black and Hispanic entrepreneurs, which I'm going around the country doing. And what I'm saying is that, hey, for the Black and Hispanic community to really get into the game and become fully invested in the country, right? And that's two things. Number one, we've got to stop illegal immigration because that's suppressing wages at the working class level. Also, we got to redo the trade deals so that manufacturing jobs start coming back, and it's not this unfair competition to American labor. And number three, we've got to start having access to capital to Black and Hispanic entrepreneurs. And one of the reasons we do that in the financial crisis, guess what? The elites took care of making sure that Citicorp was recapitalized and Goldman Sachs had the ability to become a bank holding company, and all the vested interests were all taken care of, either with bank holding company or capital or everything like that. The guys that got crushed were the community banks. And why the community banks get crushed? Because they lend to Black and Hispanic business.
To these small businessmen that are trying to get up.
And I said, you're not in the room, you're not in the deal. And the whole purpose of this economic nationalism and populism is to give voice to the voiceless, The deplorables are also the black and Hispanic working class. And I'm telling you, I can see from giving these, this is like the second or third talk I've given. I'm start doing them every couple of weeks and putting together a task force of black and Hispanic entrepreneurs. They're all signing up. And I just tell people, and this is what the elites in the Republican Party don't get. Once you turn that, and that's why the media and that's why the Democrats are so freaked out about it.
Right.
Once you turn that, you've really done a turn like 1932. It's a permanent realignment. My goal, my objective, what I've dedicated my life to is to turning this populist, nationalist, conservative movement and use it and take the vehicle of the Republican Party, which I think today's like the Whigs. Take that apparatus, take it over, make that a workers-based party. That will realign American politics for 50 years.
And that seems to me what people don't understand is that they look at like one individual race or what's going on this year, and they don't realize that you're thinking of a long-term change. And is it correct to say that you believe
by the way, we're going to have
that a lot of this has already occurred at the base?
Yes.
But you're trying to translate it into the representation in Washington, which hasn't gotten the joke that everything has changed.
If you go around the talks I've given in the last 7 weeks, I've talked to the Christian Right to Value voters and at the Dobson Conference at CMP out in Colorado Springs. I've talked to the populist movement out in Arizona. I've talked to economic nationalists. I talked to last night to the Zionist Organization America, ZOA, and my pitch is the same thing. The establishment in defense of Israel, in defending anti-Semitism, same thing. The establishment's giving you happy talk. They're giving you just as much as they need to get your money and your donation, and no more. And by the way, they actually had Dershowitz and Chris Ruddy, who I really like. I love these guys. They came on before. Dershowitz gave a talk and gave an award to Ruddy. And the whole thing is about moderation. Dershowitz goes, I'm a Democrat. We got the center has to hold, and we have to have the communication of both parties, both groups. And Ruddy, who runs Newsmax, is very much a moderate. It's always in the paper, although we're buddies. He's always in the paper saying Bannon's too crazy and too wild. Trump's got to moderate. And they got up there and said their thing. And, there's some nice applause. I get up there and I'm like, throwing down and saying, hey, I'm not an ass. I love these guys, but I'm not a moderate. I'm a fighter, and I'm a fighter of Israel. And the place went crazy. Because you know why? We're not. History goes through cycles. We're just not in a cycle of moderation now. It's just not. We're not going to hug this out. Right. You're not going to pat people on the head and say, "Hey, just listen to me and it'll be better." Some guys in the opposition don't want to listen to you. Are not going to listen to you. You're going to have to win. That's why victory is so important. And I think, by the way, and so the Jewish people last night, they couldn't get enough of it because they're ready to fight. They understand that they went along and played along. You know what they got? They got Corker in the Iran deal. Right. Or they play along. The introduction said, "Hey, Bannon." Lee Zeldin, one of the two Jewish Republican congressmen, said, "Hey, Bannon wasn't there when the Abbas and the Palestinians came because he said, I don't want to eat lunch with a guy that has blood on his hand of innocent Jewish civilians." And the place went crazy. And I said, hey, that's just the way I feel, and I'm not going to moderate my views.
Yeah, well, I'm Jewish and I'm a Republican, and I'm not sure how you support Israel and be a Democrat, because it's always the Republicans, and particularly the base Republicans, that are very supportive of Israel. So tell me then a little bit, let's more clearly define it. How does what you're doing, the populism, and it's populist conservatism, what are the key ways?
Populist nationalism.
Populist nationalism, but with a conservative tilt.
Absolutely.
How does it differ from traditional conservatism? And it seems to be what most people have embraced. There was a recent poll that said something like 80% of Republicans said we're Trump Republicans, not like like Goldwater Republicans even or Cato Republicans or anything like that.
Pretty amazing.
Right, it is amazing. And people here in Washington don't get it, that is what's happening. But give me the specific ways, there's trade, there's immigration, how populist nationalism differs from traditional conservatism.
Well, I think there's three broad, what I call verticals or buckets that when we got in there mid-August, that the Trump campaign it kind of didn't realign itself with, but kind of brought to the forefront as the Trump message. And the first, I think, is to stop mass illegal immigration and start to limit legal immigration and kind of get your sovereignty back, Number two was to bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States. And number three is to get us out of these pointless foreign wars. Those are the three big headings. A lot of stuff falls up underneath that, according to America First on your foreign policy and build the wall, etc. So I think that's directionally what it is, and there's a lot of things underneath it. But I think the first part is that what Trump is really he's a tribune of the working class and middle class of this country. It's people that get paychecks, that don't have a tremendous amount of assets, that are not kind of the asset holders. They're working people. By the way, if you're a high school graduate, you have not had a raise in real dollars since I think 1972.
Right.
Right? Whereas
Uh-huh.
assets have inflated the last 8 years because that's how we took care of the financial crisis. We just turned the spigots on for liquidity. So I think that's what Trump represents. He represents working class people in this country and people that want to put America first. And how does that describe? Is that it's not that America's isolationist at all. It's that America is more engaged in the world than it's ever been, but on America's terms. Not on the terms of these global institutions that America's got to be one part of us. Is that where it's in the vital national security interest of the United States. It will be in the vital national security interest of our partners and our allies. And I think that's what the Trump movement means. And I think that's why you see now the Republican establishment, is in shock about this. But if you go back and look at the primaries in 2015 or 2016, I think it's 85% of the vote was with Donald Trump,
Yes.
Ted Cruz, and Ben Carson.
Right.
I said the other one. That's 85. It's only 15% really what I call establishment Republicans.
Right, and the ones who were supposed to dominate, Jeb Bush and so forth, the establishment Republicans, it
Marco
never
Rubio,
it didn't
John
even come
Kasich,
close to
right.
happening.
There's 15%. And that's what I keep saying. It's about an 80-20 party right now. Now, the 20% happens to have most of the donors.
Right.
But the point I make to donors is that if you see what's out there right now, you're going to have two choices. You're going to have the center-right populism, which is about deconstruction of the administrative state. It's about entrepreneurial finance, right? It's about more participation by entrepreneurs and also redoing the trade deals and limiting illegal immigration, letting the little guy get a piece of the action. That action at first being higher wages, and maybe over time, to implement what Bush called the ownership or opportunity society, really think through what opportunities are and people can participate in the future versus what's coming if you don't. And I think what's coming if you don't do this is going to be, it's not Bernie Sanders. I think it's going to be a lot darker than that. So, 40% of millennials right now, in some study I just saw, believe in socialism.
Right.
So, and I don't believe it's going to be socialism. I think the other alternative would be kind of some state-sponsored capitalism, like the China model, with a handful of big companies, inextricably linked with big government, which I think is detrimental to the American entrepreneurial spirit. So, look, I'm a right-wing populist, and I'm proud of it.
You mentioned China. Let's talk a little bit about China. And again, you are not, in the way that you approach things, an isolationist. Saying that you want American sovereignty does not mean that you want to withdraw from the entire world. And you've shown that. One of the things you said to me is that a lot of the work that you're going to be doing is on the threat from China. And so I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe a little bit about Thucydides, the Thucydides Trap, what the concern is about China and how you think we should go about resisting the rise of China.
So, we're in the first week of November. I think it's November 12th today, right before the book comes out. And two things have happened over the last 2 weeks that are very important. President Xi of China in the 19th Party Congress gave a 3.5-hour speech upon accepting.
The communists are great at that, aren't they? Whether it's Castro or...
Yeah, but this is very different than Castro. I tell you, the thing prints out to about 68 pages. Every American that's interested in the country should go back and read all 68 pages of it.
Interesting.
It's that important. It is, I believe, the most important political speech of the 21st century. And I think in hindsight, people may say the 21st century really started with that speech. In addition, last week, the Watson Center at Brown University, which I know Brown University is not the most conservative university, but the Watson Center's got a very good reputation of being fair-handed, came out with an analysis that the global war on terror since 2001 has cost the nation $5.6 trillion. When you add in all the real costs, homeland security, and $5.6 trillion. We're 17 years in this thing and no closer to victory than we first started. And so I think if you look at those two things of what's happened over the United States in the last 20 years, you've seen a dramatic rise of China. And that's gone along. Our elites have not just been okay with it, they've helped exacerbated that rise in China by telling us from day one that it was going to be because of, as China got wealthier, they become more liberal Democrats and more free market capitalists. We now know, and Xi's speech lays it out.
We were going to be equal friends. We're going to be like partners and friends, and they're going to change their whole mentality and system.
Equal friends, and in fact, we're not. And the speech of Xi is very specific. He says that basically the Confucian mercantilist authoritative model is the wave of the future.
Interesting.
In fact, they've always said up until today, they're very big on dates, and they always use the date 2049 because it's the 100th anniversary of one day. So everything was going to happen by 2049. In this speech, he refers to one date, I think 3 times, and that's 2050, which is the beginning of the new era.
Okay.
That is when they really officially, kind of take over. And so, and that is why there's 5 things I think that happen in the next. And by the way, you couple that with us spending $5.6 trillion on this global war on terror,
Right.
of which, this week with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and UAE in this Qatar situation with Iran and Turkey, and it looks like the Middle East every day is spinning more and more out of control. You couple that with what we've been able to accomplish in the Middle East before President Trump got here, vis-a-vis, what has happened to China. You've seen a dramatic rise of China. The United States kind of captured in this whirlwind, much of its own making. And so you look at the elites in this country and say, hey, if you guys are so good, how do we get this fix? And these aren't small. These aren't small decisions that are on the margin. This is a way a country stops becoming a global power, stops becoming a great power. These are monumental mistakes. Now, there's about 5 things that in the next 5 or 10 years, unless we reverse by direct action, I think President Trump and his administration will be at least the administration understands this and tries to reverse it. And I think it's part of why President Obama had this pivot to Asia, is that, number one, the rollout of 5G, which China is going to dominate.
Right.
The One Belt, One Road, which is China's geopolitical expansion throughout the central heartland of Asia. The Plan 2025, which is China's plan to dominate 10 industries by 2025, including production of silicon chips, artificial intelligence, and robotics, which means they will take over all advanced manufacturing. The conversion of the RMB into petrodollar, so they'll take away our ability to be the reserve currency, which will dramatically change our financial landscape. And the last will be advances in financial technology, where we have the ultimate leverage right now to decouple the Chinese from the global capital markets.
Right.
In about 5 years, we're not going to have that ability. So China and what they're laying out, this concept among our elite is called the Thucydides Trap, which is the difference in the rising Athens versus declining Sparta and how you avoid war. It's quite evident, and Pat Cadell and I talk about this a lot, is that America's elites are quite comfortable with managing America's decline. As long as that decline, by the way, and a lot of countries have done that, as long as that decline is comfortable, we're the junior partner to the hegemonic power, we can guide them to their better angels, and that for the elites, that decline can be just as profitable as the rise. Who's not comfortable with that is that neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia in the 1950s. It's that those American working class people and American middle class people are not. I make the analogy to World War II. Winston Churchill, who had been kind of an outrider in the Conservative Party and thought of as a wingnut, what really had his back, well, when the elites in England, including the royal family, were trying to cut some deal with Hitler in 1940
to manage him.
To manage Hitler, when the whole thing of appeasement was the management of Hitler. When that became, when he started taking countries like Poland and France, it could no longer happen. They still they were thinking about cutting a deal with, hey, we can have some managed decline here. We'll still keep our empire. He'll keep all of Europe. And it was working class labor guys in England said, no way, we'll never agree to that.
They were Churchill's backers.
They were Churchill's backers. I think that is the vote that backed Donald Trump in the upper Midwest. That's Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania. It's those blue collar and middle class Americans that said, hey, we don't want managed decline. We want those factories back. If you read J.D. Vance's, and J.D. Vance has got the sociological book of the Trump revolt, which is Hillbilly Elegies. He actually pointed me to 2 studies I hadn't seen. It was from some Harvard and MIT guys that said there's a direct correlation between the factories that left, the workers left behind, and the opioid addiction problem. You see a culture in society, and this gets back to my point that's more than just economics. You see a culture in society that's imploding in the great heartland of this country.
And you need that to keep the country great and to keep it opposing rising powers like China. I think China touches on so much of what you believe. So, okay, unfortunately, we do have to wrap this up. I have so much more here.
Is all this in the book?
To get to.
Is all this in the book? I'm gonna have to get a copy.
No. I don't know. I might, if that's recorded, I'll write another book actually off of this last interview. But no, there were some things, but a lot of new stuff. But it's really been a pleasure. I think you see here what a interesting person Steve is, and how much thinking and knowledge goes into what he's doing. It's way beyond the caricature that you often see in the mainstream media. So Steve, thank you very much.
Thanks.
It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for doing the book.
It's You can get it on Amazon. Or stop mentioning Bezos and Amazon.
Stop mentioning.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh no, go to a
you're
bookstore.
gonna kill you. You're gonna kill me. Okay, or Barnes and
I'm
Noble,
a bookstore
Amazon,
guy.
anywhere you want to buy it. It's available.
Go to Barnes and Noble. Or better yet, go to an independent bookstore. Go to an independent bookstore, and if they don't have your copy, don't have a copy sitting up front, ask them to order one.
You can get it on Amazon.com. Bezos gets none of that. Don't worry.